Hello, everyone, and welcome to the April Cybersecurity Insider webinar. Our topic today is cloud versus on-premises and lessons learned. Our presenter today is Mike Donahue. Mike is the Vice President of Client Services at CloudWave. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike to get us started.
Thank you very much, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us. As Laura mentioned, my name is Mike Donahue. I'm the Vice President of Client Services at CloudWave. I have operational responsibility for our delivery organization as well as sales engineering. And a little bit about my background, I've been with CloudWave for 11 years. And prior to coming over to CloudWave, I actually spent time at 4 different health systems directly. 3 as system administrator type roles, and I did a year-long stint at a IDN in the Midwest of a 12 hospital network that I was there as the IT director for 1 year. So wide array of experience coming directly from healthcare, and really have seen how cloud has impacted both positively and negatively healthcare over the last 5 or 10 years. Just to jump right in, I think it's important to understand how we define cloud computing, and really the delivery of computing services, server storage, database, networking, delivered over the internet to your facilities, really to allow faster, more innovation, scalable resources for you to consume. And what we're seeing in the cloud market is, this is actually from a HIMSS analysis, that we're expecting to see this industry grow about $30 billion over the next 2 or 3 years, which is fascinating. But I think it's also going to continue to drive a lot of very important innovation for healthcare and continue to drive better outcomes for our communities and our patients. And this is a quote that I love to reference, and really comes from the former federal CIO of the US government. But why are we seeing this cloud adoption take place within our sector? And very well put, just like water from the tap in your kitchen, it can be turned on and off as quickly as it's needed. And like the water, there's a team of dedicated professionals making sure that it's safe, secure, and available on a 24-hour, 24/7, 365 basis. And in our industry, that is the most important: secure and available to allow our clinicians and our physicians to deliver clinical care. I will preface that I do think there's some detail that goes around this statement that we'll dive in more a little bit later within the presentation. And there are multiple cloud deployment models, and this is something that continues to pivot and shift as cloud becomes more comfortable within the healthcare sector. Obviously, the most common that we're seeing is public cloud, open hyperscaler type solutions, whether it's IBM, now Oracle, AWS, Azure, GCP. And there's certain use cases that we're seeing really explode within the public cloud. Private cloud, that can be a private cloud provider like CloudWave, or that can simply mean that you're still running your workloads on premise in your facility. One of the latest and more newer innovations that we're seeing take place from a cloud computing perspective is the concept of community clouds. This is something that we're seeing in rural health systems in certain pockets within the US, but also very commonly being deployed in the international space. Predominantly the UK, where it's public sector government run, and they're able to gain significant efficiencies by having multiple trusts run out of the same community cloud platform and not have to make the individual investments in IT infrastructure and operations. Excuse me. And lastly, and one of the most common that we see, and I think this is going to be that way for a very long time, is the concept of hybrid cloud. Combination of on-premise infrastructure and leveraging either managed private, community, public cloud services for the right workloads that make sense for your organization. And if we dive into those concepts a little bit further of what are the common use cases that CloudWave has observed across the industry for either private edge cloud, hybrid cloud, or even public cloud. And if we start with private and edge, one of the biggest drivers that we see is highly sensitive to latency applications. These applications are in many cases tied directly to point of care. I always use the analogy, and it's overused at this point, fetal monitoring. We do not want to necessarily leverage or move applications that are tied to patient safety and patient life into the cloud, where an internet outage, for example, could mean that you're no longer able to treat that patient. That ties very closely into number two, which is WAN latency and resiliency. We have a number of customers, for example, that are just 100 miles away from major metropolitan areas. There's a single internet provider that goes the last mile. There's no redundancy, and there's oil fracking taking place for 40 miles as you enter the community. It is very difficult for that organization or those types of organizations to consume cloud services like someone can if they were in rural Boston, for example. Data sovereignty, this comes into play more so in the international space. And a recent example that I've come into is we're working with an organization, the government of South Africa. They're working with an ISV that has a SaaS-based offering that leverages the GCP hyperscaler, but GCP isn't available in South Africa. So they're unable to deliver their SaaS offering. So we're working on alternatives to deliver that with the hyperscaler that is available, being AWS. The government has made the decision that it makes sense for them to consume cloud services from an economic perspective and a scalability perspective, but they can't allow their data to leave the country. So data sovereignty becomes very important for more of the international markets where hyperscalers and cloud providers haven't made the investment across the globe. And lastly, capital funding. Traditionally, the way that public cloud or even majority of cloud services are consumed as an end user is in an operational financial structure. And in some cases, if you're being funded by your foundation through one-time donations from the community, you're reliant on capital funding. You need depreciable assets in your data center that you need to see the life over 5 years of. And consuming cloud in that model becomes very difficult. Hybrid, and again, as I mentioned previously, probably the most common that we see deployed in healthcare organizations today. The best use cases are disaster recovery, image archiving, storage of backups, in some cases, individual application hosting, or in others, either full EHR hosting, and security. This is really where we've seen the biggest growth as our organization continues to mature from our journey of building our first private managed cloud in 2011 for healthcare organizations to 2023. Hybrid continues to be the starting point on most cloud transformation journeys. And when you think about from the perspective of you're rolling out a new EHR system, you're rolling out a new payroll system, whatever it may be, to spend capital to run it in your data center, but then also have to develop and spend money on assets that are designated as standby, just in case something goes wrong. That is where we really see the total cost of ownership make a lot of sense for organizations to leverage the cloud model, because they have the ability to turn it on and off, just like the analogy of the water. And lastly, public cloud. This is where in the last recent years, we've seen a continued growth in this space. And really it's the cost efficiencies that companies like CloudWave or self-managed IT organizations are unable to hit that price point at scale. Long-term backup data, immutable backups. This is something that from a cyber insurance perspective, if you've gone through a renewal recently, you've probably seen this requirement start to pop up. And if not, you've probably been warned that it is coming. Driving immutable backups is one of the hot topics right now from a security perspective. And the public cloud is able to do that at scale very easily. Long-term archive data, disaster recovery, general application hosting. Email is always the easiest example. Within the next 5 years, whether you like Microsoft or not, they're probably going to force their customers, if they want to continue to consume Outlook or Exchange, for example, you're going to have to look at Office 365, and you will be deploying some level of cloud. And when we look at what's really driving this from a IT leadership perspective is this concept of building versus consuming. And this has been around forever, whether it's CloudWave looking at an acquisition, do we build it or do we go consume it or buy it? And this is really what we built this with our customers of, if I have to build it myself on premise, I've got a continuing investment in hardware and maintenance. I've got lagging ability to leverage new technologies that have become immediately available, potentially insignificant disaster readiness across the organization. You lack agility. And one of the biggest things that we see really in the small to mid healthcare market is the scarcity of skilled technologists. Not saying that they're not available, but being able to implement some of these new enterprise-wide systems, the technology has scaled up so drastically that being able to retain staff is one of the challenges a lot of our customers have shared with us. And if we look at the benefits that cloud brings in this operating model is you don't have any hardware or maintenance costs on an ongoing basis. Technology upgrades are included at no additional cost. I will preface that by saying that there's a lot of OEMs now that in order to stay competitive with the public cloud adoption in the market, they're now building their on-premise physical infrastructure to align with that one bullet, that they are, as they release new functionality of their storage array, for example, you are able to consume that at no cost. Public cloud is going to drive, or cloud is going to drive full disaster recovery capabilities, resources on the demand being able to scale up and down. And in many cases, daily operations and support are included. I put some asterisk there because I do think one of the biggest misconceptions around cloud is that it always comes fully managed, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But I wanted to share this with the team, which is what we saw take place in really Q1 2020, where obviously I was really hoping to never have to put a COVID-19 impact slide ever again in a presentation. But looking at this, I think the rapid acceleration of cloud growth in the last 3 years was actually driven from the COVID-19 pandemic. We saw cloud spending rise 35% during the first quarter of 2020, and it hasn't dipped. And I think a lot of the drivers for that were the challenge put on healthcare organizations to rapidly deploy telemedicine solutions, to be able to do everything possible to serve their communities in this absolute disaster at a time. And cloud became the entry point for a lot of for a lot of organizations to really start adopting cloud. So this is a question that we're not going to do a poll on, but I really, as we go through the rest of the presentation, I want you to think about your organization and how do you consume cloud services today? Or do you have plans for how you will consume cloud services? And there's a lot of different methodologies around what makes sense for your organization. The first being fully managed by the hyperscaler. The example I use, Office 365. You can move your mail platform, your Office applications into Office 365 today. What you're getting is an application from a security, backup, data protection perspective. That is the responsibility of Microsoft. Do you see yourself doing a cloud services security provider? A cloud services provider, are you going to go on this cloud journey yourself and consume public cloud resources no different than you would manage your own IT infrastructure? Or are you looking at application vendors that are offering SaaS-based models, which is going to continue to become more frequent how do you plan on consuming this, and what is the risk to your organization depending on the model? Because these different operating structures truly have a significant differentiation on how we look at security and operations in the cloud. And I think when I was thinking about this from my time at the health systems, I think the answer is yes to some capacity. And I think we'll continue to see workloads will drive individual requirements. If you're looking at a new EHR, for example, and you go to the three big players in the US, we've got Cerner, Meditech, Epic. 90% of Epic customers that sign on today are actually leveraging Epic hosting. That is leveraging a cloud services provider in a SaaS model offered by the ISV. Meditech, for example, is with their new Meditech as a service platform, that is truly SaaS-based offering. And Cerner does all of, or Oracle, excuse me now, is doing everything directly within their Oracle Cloud platform. So I think workloads are going to continue to drive these individual requirements, but the implications for how you as an end user consume cloud can mean a lot to your organization. And if we look at who is using cloud today, this was based off of a 2021 HIM study that 85% of independent hospitals are in some fashion today consuming cloud services, and 91% of these organizations plan to increase their cloud investment over the next 3 years. Top reasons that were cited within that survey were things that we've discussed: scalability, cost savings, and security. We'll go into a little bit more of these in detail as I continue, but I do want to use this opportunity to say the argument has been going on for years that cloud is cheaper, or on-premise is cheaper. Where do we land? And I wish there was a smoking gun or a clear black and white answer on this. The answer truly is, from our experience, it depends. We are very fortunate to work with over 200 different operating entities across the globe in some fashion delivering cloud services. Outside of that, we still work with about another 300 or 400 operating entities that are not consuming cloud services. We certainly have the conversation with them around, does it make sense for their organization to start looking at their cloud strategy long term? But in many cases, it really does depend on where you are in your current life cycle and what is that compelling event or driver organizationally for you to look at a transition to a cloud platform. If you spent an investment 18 months ago on new core infrastructure to support your main applications and you're consuming your EHR through one of the three models that I mentioned, it probably doesn't make sense for you today to look at consuming cloud services for the remaining applications running locally off of an investment that's 18 months old. And it's finding that right time to execute that and see how the cloud technology continues to progress over the next 3 to 5 years that will make that transition easier. So I wish that there was a smoking gun of, yes, it's always cheaper to go to the cloud, it's always more expensive. It really does depend on where you are organizationally. And this is something I wanted to share with the team that unfortunately, and I think this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that's joined, that health systems remain under attack. So what we're looking at here is a graph of number of healthcare records breached from 2011 to the end of 2022. We saw in the last little bit over a decade, that increase is 254% of records breached. Certainly 2015 stands out significantly. That was the year that Anthem Blue Cross was breached. But what was interesting is in 2021, the breakdown of who was getting breached and how it was taking place is slightly different than 2022. Healthcare providers represented roughly 70% of all incidents that took place in 2022, where previously in 2021, that number was about 40%, and the remaining was coming through business associates. And what you'll see on the right is something I found fascinating, that these bad actors, this was based off of a McAfee analysis, that healthcare is the second most targeted industry that we have, number one being financial services. And the majority of these threats are not coming from someone in California sitting in the basement. We're continuing to see threats come from Ukraine, China, Iran, and Russia. One of the latest, to briefly segue, one of the latest ransomware events that we worked with an organization with was tied directly back to Russia as the entry point for bringing down the health system. So though the statistics will show that we have foreign IP addresses trying to get into health systems, we're actually now seeing that play out in the field where this malware is propagating, is being sourced to Russia and Ukraine. So you've heard me say a couple times, it depends. And I wanted to take a moment to present, when we talk about cloud, what it truly means from a shared responsibility model. And this is an example, and I have another one specifically to two hyperscalers on the next slide. But depending on how you plan on consuming cloud services really does depend on, depending on how you consume cloud services depends on your responsibility at the end of the day for managing those assets. So traditional private cloud on-premise in your data center, you are responsible for data, application, OS, all the way down to the physical security. You look at infrastructure and platform as a service offerings traditionally, where you're still responsible for the data, you're responsible for the applications, the OS may vary, but the virtualization technology, core infrastructure, and the physical security becomes the responsibility of the provider that you select. And even in a SaaS model, application, OS, virtualization, still all the responsibility of the provider. The one commonality across all of these is you are still responsible for your data. And if we look at the different operating models we discussed of self-managing cloud assets, the story that resonates with me the most is the 2019 Capital One breach. Capital One was running in AWS. If you consumed Capital One services like I did, you were notified that your data was now being available on the dark web. Within 45 minutes of that breach going public, AWS had a statement released that while they are responsible for management and security of the cloud, it is the end user's responsibility of security in the cloud. And that's something that always resonated with me, that we, I believe, in healthcare and other industries have this perception that moving to the cloud means I'm safer inherently because it's not my responsibility anymore. And in some cases, under a cloud security services provider, even under some cloud service providers, that is the case, that the security of the assets running within their purview is 100% their responsibility. But if you're looking at self-managed models, the hyperscalers are very, very clear on this, and it's on very, very fine print when you sign up to leverage and consume their services. Responsibility for security in the cloud is the customers, is the end users. And the reason for that is 65 to 70% of all security issues in the cloud start with a misconfiguration. Going back to that AWS example, that was a firewall, virtual firewall running in AWS that was misconfigured. One click of a button, one human error mistake ended up costing Capital One, I'm guessing, millions and millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars on the back end. And AWS was not shy from saying, we secured the building, we secured access to the building, we secured the physical assets and the hypervisor, but someone made a misconfiguration and that's what caused it. That is the responsibility of Capital One, not AWS. And I think as we look at addressing cloud vulnerabilities, this is certainly not meant to be all encompassing, but the four major things that we have seen that tie to that 65 to 70% of security issues within the cloud platform start with misconfiguration are around identity and access management, both roles as well as policies. What that means is, how are you procuring and provisioning your services to your end users from an account perspective? One of the things that we come across far too often as we go out and do cloud analysis or transformation assessments is we'll look at Active Directory, for example. We run a report to show all passwords that are currently being used that are known on the dark web. We'll run an analysis to identify all users that have domain privileges that are elevated. And I don't think we've come across an organization yet that has not had an ex-employee that had domain admin privileges that was still on, or they've elevated Dr. Smith because he wanted to watch Netflix on the overnight shift and he needed to bypass the web filter. And the only way you can do that is to provision domain admin credentials. It is something that still happens far too common in our industry. And it's actually one of the leading reasons why breaches continue to rise within our space. Once you're able to get after that end user, obtain that privilege, now you have the keys to the kingdom for all intents and purposes to go do what you want to do within that environment. And trust policies granted at the organizational level, permissions granted at the folder level and project level. Those are all very specific to cloud technologies, but making sure that your cloud provider, or if you're going on the journey yourself in consuming cloud services, how are you provisioning credentials to the management team of that? Is it at the org level, individual folder, or individual projects? Network misconfiguration is, again, the driver behind the Capital One breach, that routing rules, private subnet rules, and then lastly, firewall rules. Far too often, we have actually seen things in troubleshooting, for example, that we're trying to make an interface engine work, or an organization was trying to make sure that data was flowing properly between two disparate systems. As a part of that troubleshooting, there was an any rule opened. Anyone can talk to anything. It works. Now everyone's happy to go on to the next fire. That now is a significant vulnerability running either in your environment or in the cloud, and is one of the core drivers. And I wanted to share a couple other notable cloud vulnerabilities. That there was a voice over IP company that lost 350 million customer records. And that was everything from SSNs, in some cases, sensitive health information that was stored. And that was because it was stored online in a database that didn't need a password to grant access to the data itself. It sounds so silly, but in our space, in our market, all the technology in the world is not going to alleviate the need for, is never going to alleviate human error. It's still probably the biggest threat risk that we all have in our day-to-day jobs. How can we minimize human error? And then the last example, researchers discovered misconfiguration of S3 storage that ended up leaking 60,000 patient records with PHI that was tied to a large cardiac data network. Again, that is 100% a human error from a misconfiguration, and the hyperscalers do not take any responsibility on that. So what does this mean, and how can we improve organizationally, whether you're running on-prem, whether you're running in the cloud, whether you're consuming services from a cloud provider? These are things that I think, being a cloud services provider, we have a lot of our customers put us through the paces on how are we planning on protecting their assets. And I think it starts with set up the correct cloud portfolio. Look at who you're working with, look at their processes and procedures, because at the end of the day, the one commonality we discovered is the data is still your responsibility. Cloud VPNs, making sure that if you have VPNs to either B2B through other partners or into the cloud, making sure that you have secure firewall rules for traffic over that VPN. Multi-factor authentication, my hope is that the team on the call at this point has implemented or is in the process of implementing MFA, though the threat actors are getting more sophisticated every day. Our old product manager used to say, we build a 10-foot wall, they have an 11-foot ladder, and we need to now go build a 15-foot wall. And there's absolute truth to that. But basic things like multi-factor authentication can provide that one layer where it's just aggravating enough for the threat actor to not want to proceed. You know, Microsoft has statistics that 99.9% MFA can block 99.9%. I'm a little skeptical on that. I think they're just pushing their MFA solution, but I would say from what we've observed, probably 95, 97% is blocked when MFA is there just to be a barrier to progress. Secure interfaces and APIs, secure data at the endpoints, making sure that your endpoints in the organization, in many cases, are the first asset that is going to be impacted through whether it's phishing, that they're able to obtain passwords, and that's where identity access and management plays a very important role to ensure that your end users do not have elevated privileges, but you're also not storing anything at that endpoint that would give them instant access to PHI. Keeping multiple backups, regardless of great security hygiene, everything else, backups are the last line of defense. Being able to know if something happens, I know my data is clean, and including immutability. And this is something I mentioned earlier to the group, that is a new requirement that I think is going to continue to be pushed from the cyber insurance providers. And then lastly, prepare a disaster recovery plan. And we'll get into this a little bit more on the next slide, but what does a disaster mean to you? A disaster and cyber recovery concepts, I would say candidly, has changed significantly over the last 5 years. We used to identify words like RPO and RTO. Recovery point objective, recovery time objective. How old is my data that I need to restore from, and how fast can I restore that data before I'm operational again? We're seeing that in a cyber event, those metrics are almost thrown away. And one of the key metrics that I really like to talk to organizations about is something I call decision time objective, DTO. And that is how long before the organization is willing to make a decision to invoke their disaster plans. There are certain things that come with cyber recovery, contacting the authorities, engaging with your cyber insurance. They're going to engage with their forensics team. They have to understand where the threat came from. Is it still spreading? They have to put a Band-Aid on it. And while that's taking place, is the organization prepared to execute their disaster recovery concepts from a technology perspective? One of the things that we have seen be a very large challenge is in IT, and coming from a technologist background, it's something I can relate to. I always wanted 1 more hour. I always wanted 5 more minutes, 5 more minutes. Let me fix this. A lot of us get into IT because we love to troubleshoot. We love to fix problems. And when you're dealing with a cyber event or an organizational disaster, that is a horrible time to say 5 more minutes, 5 more minutes, because every minute that you're delayed not executing your plan becomes more detrimental to your community. And if we look at what really matters when a cyber event hits, this is certainly just from my perspective, patient safety, being able to deliver clinical care. How can I ensure operationally that I can still deliver care to the patients that are in my facility today? What processes and procedures do I need to have to ensure when a shift change comes in, I'm not at risk with making sure that med-surg doesn't know what time I did med distribution to this patient. Being able to continue to provide clinical care also to the community. Restorable data, speed of recovery, and lastly, organizational expectations and communication. One of the things that we've seen really be detrimental in the space and still kind of playing out in the legal system is communication plans and organizational expectations. There is nothing worse than when you're dealing with something like this, whether it's as a director of IT, CIO, CMIO, to have your CEO have different expectations on what it is that should have been happening. And we call that boardroom to basement alignment. How can you ensure that from the top level executives to the transportation unit within your facility, everyone knows what to do if and when this happens to your organization? And the question I always leave the team with is, do you feel prepared today? And if not, tips and recommendations. You cannot be over prepared for this. Ensuring that you have all of your systems being protected, you're validating that, you're testing your restores, you're going through tabletop exercises. This is something that we've seen be very beneficial to organizations as they look at cloud strategy, on-prem strategy, and overarching security strategies is, how do I get boardroom to basement alignment? How can I ensure that my chief nursing officer, my chief medical officer, and my CIO and my CEO know exactly what I need to do if and when that button calls? Executing your DR test, train the team. I always say, don't buy software, buy expertise. There's a statistic that's been floating around the cyberspace for a number of years now that roughly, I think 45 or 50% of security software gets purchased but never fully implemented. Leverage expertise from your community and your peers. Consider cloud solutions as tools, not answers. And if you've taken anything from what we've talked about today is cloud more secure? The short answer is it depends how you're consuming it. I think in many cases it can be, but on the surface, you're still responsible and accountable for your data that you're storing there. And I think to simplify it, it really is a handshake agreement and a partnership, whether it's through a cloud security services provider, a CSP, or you and the hyperscaler directly. We have seen compromises take place because of on-premise tools, devices, and accounts that are able to actually give unauthorized access to cloud services. So going back to, does cloud mean that you're safer than on-prem? Short answer is no. That security hygiene, whether your deployment model is SaaS, self-managed, or through partnerships, it is a joint venture and a handshake agreement that you need to have alignment on for how you're going to ensure that bad things don't happen together. And lastly, special interest in healthcare sector is going to continue to grow. I think at one point, Social Security numbers on the dark web were going for $25, $30. We're seeing medical records go for on the dark web upwards of $200 or $300. So the interest in healthcare, though it takes a really horrible person to want to shut down a healthcare facility, the financial gain that is at their disposal once they have access to the data is why we're being targeted at such rapid rates. So I'll pause for questions. I think I was right where I wanted to be on time.
Okay, Mike, we don't have any specific questions right now, but if anyone does have a question, feel free to enter it in the questions pane in your control panel, and we'll get that answered for you. And so while we're waiting on that, Mike, if you want to go to the next slide, and I'll cover some information about the Cybersecurity Insider program in general. Just wanted to cover a few things, expectations, and additional information about what to expect coming up. Just wanted to run through the emails that we've been sending out monthly and make sure that you're receiving those and that you know what to expect going forward if you're newer to the program. We do send out a webinar reminder email, and that will come out the day before the monthly webinars, which is the last Thursday of every month. And in addition to that, you will also get a webinar link that will come from GoToWebinar under my name. And this is the email address here that it will come from. And we also will send out a tech alert, which is an alert if we see any significant threats that we think you should be aware of, and we give recommended actions to take. So we've sent a handful of those out in the past couple months, and we do reserve those for the more serious threats that you should really be paying attention to. And the title in those emails will contain tech alert, so you can pay special attention to that. Last month, we sent out a new email called Cybersecurity Insider Monthly News. And this is just to give you a snapshot of what's coming up for that month, what you can expect from webinar topics and anything special that's going on. So those are the general standard emails that we'll send. If anything else comes up that you need to be aware of, we'll send that out as well. You can go to the next slide, Mike. And I just want to make a note, if some of you may have spam filters in place, we do utilize HubSpot to send out these monthly emails. So if you're not receiving those emails that I just went over, there's a few things you can do to whitelist or add our information to your allow list. We have a list of IP addresses that you can add, or you can add these sending domains. And I did put a document together that's on the member resources page that you should have access to. And before the close here, I'll go ahead and add that to the chat as well. But all of that information is there on the member resources page. And I just wanted to go over some of the upcoming events in May that you can look for. So May 11th, we're having a special session that is a virtual tabletop simulation. So this is a great session for you to invite any members of your team that are responsible for security or IT or on your incident response team. So what we'll do in this session is you'll get some education on incident response, best practices, things to think about, and determine if you need to make changes in your process. And then we'll go through some real life incidents that you can take the time to look at your incident response plan and determine if you have any gaps. So that's going to be a 4-hour session, but we do encourage you to attend that in person. We will record it, but it's best utilized in person. The May 25th webinar is going to be all around securing your AI systems in healthcare. One of the tech alerts we sent out recently was around AI and ChatGPT specifically. We got a lot of feedback and questions and concerns around AI. So we've rearranged the webinar schedule a little bit to include this in the May timeframe. And Mike was talking about, we build the wall 10 feet, the cyber attackers build their ladder 11 feet tall. Someone commented in the questions, can we electrify that wall? And this is really your way to electrify that wall. The equivalent is to put additional security measures in place, try and stay ahead of the cyber attackers. And so this AI session will be very informative and give you some best practices for AI specifically. And in the resources page that I just posted in the chat, in case you don't have these webinars on your monthly calendar, there is a link there to add this save the date to your calendar so that you don't miss any of the webinars. And you can feel free to visit that resources page for all the links to the YouTube channel and the LinkedIn group and everything else. Just a note on the May 11th virtual tabletop and the May 25th and all monthly webinars, because you are registered for the Insider program, you will automatically be included in those. So you use the same link for the virtual tabletop simulation, it's free of charge, and you use the same link as you use for all the monthly webinars. And I think those were all the updates, yes. So I don't see any other questions in the questions pane. So I want to thank everyone for joining today. Please reach out anytime you have questions. There will be a short survey at the end of this webinar when you close out. Just give us any feedback that you have, any ideas for future topics that you'd like to see covered. And thank you for your time today. Thanks, Mike, for your presentation.
Thank you, everyone.